a lot of changes coming July 1st. So let's talk about some of those immediate changes. So the new trade agreement comes into place. Implementation is effective July 1st. So a little bit of history on the agreement. It was originally signed by the three parties on November 30th, 2018. And then the journey to ratification and implementation, as you guys can see, has been a couple years. So implementation is to take place 3 months after the last country ratifies it. So Canada was the last country to ratify in March. A lot of industry groups lobbied to delay implementation. I know we're all going through challenging times right now. However, that lobbying effort was unsuccessful, so we carry on. And of course, this fully replaces NAFTA. And really, if I believe, and you'll, sorry, I got ahead of myself a little bit there. So really, I think it's the first trade agreement in history known by a different name in each signing country. So in Canada, it's called CUSMA, the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement. In the US, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. And in Mexico, the T-MEC. Now you'll notice that the word trade is not actually mentioned in the name of the agreement. And I don't know, I think that might be a little telling given the parties involved. So your goods come July 1st, may be subject to duty if your goods have not been certified under the new trade agreement. So just to really point home is that the NAFTA certificates will no longer be valid after June 30th. And we'll talk about some of these other things around agriculture. We'll talk about some other product categories that are affected. We'll talk about something called de minimis amounts, where no duties and tax applies. And there's some other value thresholds that have changed under the agreement. So the rules of origin. So this is where the real details are and how you decide whether your goods qualify under the trade agreement. So many of your goods that qualified under NAFTA rules of origin will probably still qualify under the new trade agreement. However, you can't presume that will be the case. So it's really about looking at the rules of origin, looking at your rule under NAFTA, and comparing the rule of origin under the new trade agreement. So some goods require a higher regional value content, and or they may require a more difficult tariff shift requirement. So just a couple things on that. The actual structure of the rules are very similar to NAFTA, but it was more about changing the actual tariff shift or the regional value for some of the products. So it's really centered around the end classification of your goods, as well as the classifications of your parts and ingredients, and making sure that the tariff shifts have occurred and where required a regional value content is met. Now, we've also noticed, and a little bit unexpectedly, that some products have a lower bar to qualify. So, but again, the devil's really in the details there. So generally speaking, some product categories that I think that everybody has to be careful with, and that, that may have changed is pharmaceutical, healthcare, oh, it went too fast there, healthcare products, cosmetics, chemicals, steel, automotive, and textiles. So some specific product rules we'll talk about. So really, automotive was one of the main motivating factors in renegotiating the agreement. The automotive rules were very complicated under NAFTA. And from what I've seen, they are even more complicated under CUSMA. So some of these rules have a transition period. So it's one of the few areas in the agreement where there is a transition period. So the 75% content has a 3 years to get to that point. Same with some of the inputs, the parts that go into the manufacturing process. One of the, I guess, could have been unintended or intended consequences is that it also affects some aftermarket auto parts. So some parts may require up to a 70% content, where in the past it might have been 50%. So again, it's a matter of really digging into the rules and finding out exactly which parts that applies to. So just a quick thing about dairy, and this kind of applies across some of the agricultural products. In Canada, the supply management program, where at the end of the negotiation, Canada allowed a little bit more access to our market. So specific to dairy, I think the access to the Canadian market, I think, ended up increasing by something like 3.6%. But this is an area where, regardless of whether the product qualifies under the specific rules of origin, the importers still need to have quota to be able to avoid really high punitive duties. So that has not changed, just a little bit around how much quota is allowed, and again, those thresholds have increased a little bit. So another thing we found was that there's been a change in definition for something called specially defined mixtures. Now this really specifically applies to products containing more than 20% chicken. So this really applies to a lot of the products you may find in your grocery stores. Could be a chicken rice dish or something like that, or a Mexican food type item with chicken in it. And it's really about how not to fall under the chicken quota. Okay, so a couple recipe things were changed. So for instance, I think they want the chicken to be either partly cooked or cooked now, as opposed to not, and slight tweaking on the recipes. So for importers that are involved in this, they may want to look at it and maybe adjust their recipes to apply, because once you fall under the quota, it becomes very, very problematic. So some other changes under this trade agreement. So this really applies to mostly the e-commerce area. And this is, for, at least for me, it's very interesting what they've done. Before the trade agreement comes into effect, the requirements are very simple. Your goods up to $20 Canadian don't attract duty, don't attract tax, and don't require an entry, as long as they're not regulated by other government departments. And that rule will still remain in place. However, and I would point out too, is that Canada has the lowest de minimis amount in the world. So compared to the US, where it's $800 US dollars. That's a fairly big difference. Now, this issue was certainly one of those top of mind in the negotiation. As you can imagine, and particularly the US, wanted Canada to increase their de minimis significantly, but at the end of the day, we increased it a little bit. And it's interesting to see that, again, the first rule, the $20 rule, still applies, but now you have this additional rule that applies to only shipments that come from US and Mexico, and that are only applicable to shipments that's sent by courier. So notice the postal amount doesn't change. And I could speculate the reason on that, but that's not what I'm here for. So for shipments, so effective July 1st, for shipments from US and Mexico under $40, there will be no duty or tax applicable and no customs entry required. And then if the shipment's between $40 and $150 from the US or Mexico, again by courier only, there'll be no duty, but tax will still apply. So for those that may not know, in Canada, we have the federal, the goods and services tax, but the provincial sales taxes apply for direct to consumer type sales. So, and again, yeah, a customs entry required. And the other thing I would point out is that if the goods are regulated by other government departments, so if it's a food item or something like that, you may not qualify, or you're not supposed to qualify under that. And the only other thing I would add there was that you can't purposely split shipments to take advantage of these rules. So another thing that's changed under the new trade, under CUSMA, is the low value threshold. So this may be fairly transparent, not noticed by many importers. However, this value threshold allows for expedited clearance processes in the courier mode, but it also allows for a simplified accounting process for all modes, so longer time frames and things like that. So the amount is increased up to $3,300. And so for us as brokers internally, yeah, there's going to be some administration around that, some adjustments, but again, I think it'd be fairly transparent to everyone. But the big thing I would point out here is that under this agreement, if your shipment's under $3,300, you don't require certification. So, you know, this is another example of one of these rules under the trade agreement that we wonder about. We wonder why. We wonder who it really benefits, because really, I guess we recommend that if you're an importer or an exporter, just think about certifying it regardless of value, because in the case of an audit or other situations, you may be asked to prove the origin, prove that the product actually qualifies, because it still has to qualify. You just don't require the certification. So, a few more things. So refunds. This is actually a fairly significant change. So under NAFTA, you only had one year to claim duty back in cases where you had paid it and where the goods were qualified for NAFTA. But under the new trade agreement in Canada specifically, there'll be a 4-year time frame to claim duties back. Just a quick thing on customs rulings. So in Canada, we call them advance rulings. So for those importers that might have advance rulings for origin under NAFTA, those don't transfer to the new trade agreement. And again, we'd have to recommend to reapply under those situations. The other thing I would mention is around record keeping. So even though the new trade agreement might specify, I believe it's 5 years for record keeping related to the certification process. Some countries have longer time frames. So Canada, generally speaking, for imports, you have to keep records for 6 years. So you still have to comply with the country-specific requirements. So documentation and certification. So some pretty big change here. Where was that poll question? That's the next one. We're going to have another poll question, by the way. It's coming up. It's coming up. So again, the NAFTA certificate of origin is no longer valid for shipments releasing after June 30th. You cannot use the NAFTA form to certify under CUSMA. Now, the big change really is the fact that there is no prescribed format. So the government, the parties to the agreement, the governments have not issued forms as they did with the NAFTA certificate of origin. So that allows you to choose how you want to present the information. And it could be on an invoice, it could be on another document, but there are mandatory data elements, and we'll touch on those a little bit in the next coming slides. The other change was the new trade agreement allows the importer to certify. So under NAFTA, the exporters and the producers were the ones that certified the products, completed the NAFTA certificates of origin. And that will remain so, but under CUSMA, the importer can also certify. However, again, another one of these things where we wonder why, because we're really not recommending in most circumstances that the importer does it, because the importer even has less information than the supplier or the producer, and harder to obtain that information. So again, there may be specific situations where an importer might have the knowledge, but in many cases, I would suggest they don't. So again, as I mentioned, there are minimum data elements that are required for the certification. And notice we're calling it certification as opposed to a certificate, although I see we've worded on there as a certificate. But anyway, it's really about certification in the format that you choose to certify it in. And the minimum data elements are actually pretty similar to NAFTA, so it's not a huge adjustment there. So, the other thing I would say about that is we've seen some certificates that have been dated back to January 1st. So you can't certify the blanket period. You have to start it at July 1st. So just a note there. And so Virginia, I think we have another poll question. Something about level of comfort. Here we go. Virginia, are you muted?
I am unmuted, and the poll, I believe, is visible to everybody, and we've got a minute to do it. How ready do you feel to make this transition? Let's just get a sense of where people are at.
All right, that's not too bad. Great, we've got 27 people in the room now. That's great.
We'll just give it another 15 seconds here.
Yeah, I would say I've been impressed by the short time frame in that we've been seeing a lot of certifications for the new trade agreement. So I think people have really stepped up.
Great. I'm going to share the results here. Hopefully everybody can see them. Paul, do you see here? So 10% are bring it on, 76% feel they are ready, they think they're ready, and about 15% could use a bit more support. Thank you very much.
Great, that's great. Well, we'll have to talk to those little support ones. Awesome, guys. Well, thanks for doing that. Let me get back into, whoops, what did I do there? Okay. Okay. So thanks for doing the poll question. That gives us a good sense of where people are at. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can support you in the process as we go forward. On our website, we have our client resources that include information on CUSMA, and we've developed some forms that, even though a form isn't required, we thought it was important that we develop those. So we have our memo, and in the memo on our website, we have the links to the specific rules of origin. It's interesting that, as important as those things are, they're really hard to find. They're really hard to find, even when you Google it, it's very hard to find. And what I find that's even harder to find is the specific rules of origin specific to automobiles and auto parts, because in the NAFTA, it followed in progression based on HS code, and it still does that except for auto parts. It takes the auto parts out and puts it further down the agreement. So there's a little note there that says the auto parts provisions start on page 227. So we've developed a PDF form, and I think that the PDF form is very easy to use, and it's good for if you have a definite limited number of products. And we have the continuation sheet as well on our website, and instructions on how to complete it. And then we have an Excel spreadsheet provided with, which is really for more extensive product lines. The other thing I would add at this point is we love it when NAFTA, there I go, you see, when the certification includes part codes specific, so we can relate it back to the actual good, okay, rather than generic descriptions. In the case of generic descriptions, it makes it difficult for the importer and in association, the broker, to decide whether that particular line item on an invoice qualifies. But it also makes it very difficult if you were unlucky to be selected for an audit by Customs for an origin audit to relate it back to the good. So that's the one thing I would add there. So we've spent a lot of time over the last few months educating ourselves on the trade agreement. So our team is ready to help, and we've listed our team there, and many of you are familiar with our team, our management team. So Graham and Mocha and Serena and Kyle and Arzu and Irina. So yeah, they are ready to help, ready to support. And then last but not least, I just want to put a plug in for our trade update. So we have a weekly trade update with important news developments over the week, and we would love and encourage people to sign up for those, send us an email, or subscribe off our website. So yes, so that's my presentation, or that's our presentation, and thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to listen in on what we feel is a very important trade agreement, a big change for many of you. So yeah, thanks for helping us as well.
I'll say thank you, Paul. 32 minutes, right on time. And we've got some questions coming in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a few of them out. I'll read them one at a time. And please send us your questions in the chat function. But the first question here is from Denise. And the question is, have the HS codes changed?
Right. Yeah, Denise. No, good question. Good question. So the HS code system is under WTO, I think, WCO, and so it's an international trade agreement. And it's usually under the trade agreements is based on the first 6 digits for the most part. There are some exceptions that take it out to the 7th or 8th, and they can be country specific. So they can change, but up to the 6th level, I would say there hasn't been no changes there.
Thanks. The second question is, do advanced rulings for tariff classifications still apply?
Yes, and you know, we certainly recommend them in a lot of circumstances, and you know, they can provide certainty. Whether you like the answer or not could be another issue, but it certainly provides certainty going forward. And if there is any doubt in HS classification, providing the ruling doesn't just allow you to provide certainty on whether there's duty or things like that, but then you can take that information and that'll specify the rule of origin as well. And it also tells you, hey, is there other government department requirements? It provides a lot of certainty around that. So yes.
Next, thank you, Paul. Next question, is the NAFTA changed only from United States to Mexico or from Canada to the United States as well?
Yeah, no, good question. Yeah, it's changed within all 3 parties. So import into Canada, import into the US, import into Mexico, all falls under this trade agreement. There are some issues in the agreement that might be country specific, but it does apply to all 3 countries.
Just a question. Will the deadline cause current shipments in June to be delayed incoming to Canada?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is an excellent question.
That comes from Paul G.
Okay, yeah. So the answer is no in the vast majority of circumstances. If we run into shipments that are clearing July 1st where we don't have certification, then we will work as hard as we can for our customers to get that in place within, we get a 5 business day time frame there, where after release we can still get the certification without paying the duty. So there will be some scrambling, but I don't think it's going to delay any shipments.
Next question, if there's no prescribed certificate, but certification is required, will CBSA release an official certificate form to help guide importers?
Yeah, no, good. Another good question. So they will not, the governments will not issue a form. We lobbied a bit to ask our industry association to develop a recommended form, and they decided not to. I can't speak to US and Mexico industry associations, but a lot of us in the private sector have developed the form. So and so that's why you'll see different forms. And I've seen, friendly competitors and all that. I've seen other forms that are different. I mean, they're all meant to provide fields for the mandatory data elements, but often you'll see other fields that might not be part of the mandatory set, and so there'll certainly be inconsistency around this, but to answer the question, the government will not.
Okay, I've got one more question from Patrick here, and then I'm going to ask XY if he can remove everybody's mics or allow everyone's mics to become live so we can just have general questions. But first question from Patrick, if a load gets into customs on June 30th but does not clear until July 1st, is it NAFTA or USMCA?
It's USMCA.
It's
So,
USMCA.
yeah, so it's based on date of release. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm hoping that people are unmuting, are able to unmute. If you just want to throw a question onto the floor, feel free to.
Yep. Everyone should be able to unmute themselves now. I've
Okay.
allowed it. Thank you.
So you can unmute yourself and join the conversation if you'd like. And we have about another 8 minutes or so before we were planning to wrap it up, and we can stick around for straggling questions, but we do want to let people go at 11:45 if they need to. And while you're waiting, Paul, I'm going to ask you one more question. This came from Brandon. What will the blanket period for CUSMA be? NAFTA had a 1-year period. Will there be any difference?
Yeah, no, that's another good question. I mean, as I mentioned, for the blanket period going forward, we can't date it any earlier than July 1st of this year. But what we recommend is that for companies that are doing the certifications, that they pick a standard expiry date. So they can still pick December 31st. It doesn't always have to be a year. So for this year, I think a lot of companies are dating them July 1st to December 31st. And then starting from there, it'll be January 1st to December 31st, just like the NAFTA process. I mean, but it doesn't have to be. It could be, any period up to a year.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions that you'd just like to ask verbally? And if there isn't one, I have one more from the chat box. What if I'm difficulty determining the HS classification?
Yeah. Well, I guess that's kind of where we come in. HS classification can be very complicated, and there can be a lot of gray areas, and it's very difficult often to just pick an HS code on the face of the tariff only, because there is a lot of background that we have access to, and legal notes and explanatory notes and court cases and other types of precedent so yeah, that's what we're here for, to help.
Paul?
Hello.
Paul?
Yes.
Steve Spencer.
Steve, hey, how's it going?
Great. Just quickly, from somebody who's not a customs person by any stretch, the certificates that we're getting from our suppliers for the North American parts, you don't need copies of those, right? That's like NAFTA in that we retain those and if asked for, we produce them, but otherwise you don't need those on file at your agency, right?
No, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, no, we just need the final certification from your company, but yeah, it's very good practice, of course, to get certifications from your suppliers, keep them on hand, and yeah, that'll be in cases of origin verification from Canada or US or Mexico for that matter, right?
Okay. Yep. Okay. Thank you.
I thank you for your question yesterday about the automotive. I do not have your full answer yet, but it is on my list.
Okay.
So Virginia, you're on mute. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah, I am. I'm just giving a moment to see if there's any more questions. And I have one more question from the chat bar. Do I still need to keep my old NAFTA certificate?
Yes. I'm glad you asked that, for sure. Yeah, definitely. And under record keeping requirements up to 6 years, and customs can audit going back 4 years. So yeah, absolutely.
I wonder if there's anything, I see we've got Graham Doron on our call. He's our customs compliance manager. Graham, is there anything that you'd like to toss into the ring as a question or a comment? And while you're thinking about that, Graham, Leanne, yes, the presentation will be available after the meeting, which will include a recording. We're going to figure out how we'll get that to people, but I know a number of you came in a bit later, so if you want to catch the first part, it will be available. There's another question here from Oscar Fernandes, and it says, for CA importation purposes, are there specific differences between a good being made in Mexico or US?
Well, I guess what I would add to that is one change they made was there is no longer a combined US-Mexico tariff treatment. So there's only the, well, I don't know if US has the same numbers, but there's just the 10 or the 11, I believe. So it's either got to be, at the end of the day, US origin, or it's got to be Mexico origin.